Hi, Circle A. It's so awesome to be back with you for our second week of the Listen series. Hope that you guys have had a great week and that you're enjoying your Dynamic Living seminar and all of the other content coming to you with our Circle A 2022 Legacy Virtual Experience. I'm super excited to be with you. I'm Melody, Skip's daughter, and we are going through our series called Listen. So we're going to jump right in because today we are talking about listening in. We're talking about listening in to ourselves. And I think it's going to be really helpful. I know that as I put this material together this week, I was reminded of so many things about my dad, and I was challenged with some of my listening in skills. So I hope that you will be the same today, reminded of so many good things and also challenged. So let's jump in. Last week, we talked about noise, right? We talked about the importance of kind of turning down the noise on some of the inputs and stimuli that are coming into our lives, into our schedules, into our minds and our hearts and our homes, so that we can do the good work of listening. And we talked about cognitive clamor. So we're going to read that definition really quick as we begin today, so that we can remember what it is that we need to turn down. Cognitive clamor, the mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual deluge of information, opinion, disruption, diversion that grows increasingly distracting and distressing as it gains space in our conscious and non-conscious awareness. Yep. We all know what we're talking about here when we talk about cognitive clamor and about noise. And so last week we talked about 4 choices that we have in the midst of the noise around us. We can either turn it down, we can turn it off, we can turn it up, or we can turn it on, right? So we're going to begin to think about the places where we want to turn our listening on and up. And the first thing we're going to talk about is listening to ourselves. Listening in. Now, if you've been around Circle A for very long, you'll know this is one of the biggest and most valuable things that I think Skip taught us from Dynamic Living, because he taught us not only to listen into ourselves, but to listen to the right sort of things, right? I'm sure you can hear him even now telling you to take a 3x5 card and on it write down 10 things that you want to have happen to you in the next year. And then you're going to read that 3x5 card. When are you going to read it? Every morning, every night, every morning, every night, every morning, every night. Those of us who have been around this program for a while have that drilled into our psyches, I think. We know it's a good thing to do, to listen to those good things about ourselves and for ourselves once in the morning and once in the evening, right? And so we're being reminded of that in our 1987 recording of the Dynamic Living Seminar that Skip is teaching us this summer. He was teaching it all the way back then. To take that 3x5 card, write down your goals, and read it every morning and every night. And he's also reminding us, I don't know if you've gotten this far in the seminar yet, but he's also reminding us of writing a description of the sort of person that we want to be. And reading that every morning, every night, every morning, every night, every morning, every night, right? So he's taught us a lot about listening in, about listening to ourselves, right? And he also talked to himself a lot. I'm sure that you remember he would go around telling us about things that he had told himself. And he was like, and I would say to myself, self. And then he would go on to say whatever the thing it was that he had told himself, right? And while it was funny, like we all knew it was true and we all knew it was actually quite beneficial to him to have these little conversations with himself, and that he did do a pretty good job of listening to himself on a daily basis. And I think it helped him a lot in his life. And I think it can benefit all of us as well to listen to ourselves, right? And like we've said, this listening thing, listening to ourselves and to others and to God, it's important for so many pieces of our lives, for our jobs, for our schooling, for our relationships and our families and our friends, for gaining wisdom, for learning how to operate in this crazy world that we live in. Listening is such an asset. It's such a skill. So It's important, right? So let's think about listening to ourselves. And the reason we're starting with that first is because that internal work of listening to ourselves is super essential before we can do a great job listening to others, right? So, listening to ourselves. We'll start with that. So why? Why should we get better at listening to ourselves? What are some reasons why that would be helpful to us? What sort of benefit would we get in listening to ourselves? Well, I think there are three, and we're going to talk about three today. So the first one is it will allow us to tap into our intuition, thoughts, and feelings, into the things that we already know. It will allow us to tap in to our knowing. Secondly, it will allow us to heal the damage done to our hearts by both internal and external forces. Healing is the second reason. And thirdly, it will allow us to grow into the people that God created us to be. Growing is the third one. So knowing and healing and growing. Those are three great reasons to listen to ourselves. So, we can learn more about our thoughts and our feelings. We can learn more about healing and what that really means for us individually. And we can grow into the people that God created us to be. I think we're on to something with that. So, we're going to talk first about the ways of knowing. The ways of knowing. We're going to talk about our intuition, our thoughts, and our feelings. It's kind of the three ways of knowing things. And here's the thing, guys. I believe that there is truth and beauty and goodness inside of us already exists. We already know so many true and good and beautiful things about ourselves, about the world. And those things are waiting to be unlocked and affirmed and heard. And that's what I believe. It's what I believe about you. And I know that Dad believed that too. So we all have a lot of learning and growing to do, to be sure, right? But many of us have done a lot of work of learning and growing already. If you've been around the Circle A environment for any length of time at all, you've had some beautiful things planted into your mind and into your heart, right? You have done a lot of work of learning and growing into becoming the person that you're created to be. And a lot of it happened in the formative years of your life. That's what happened for me, right? We were at Circle A when we were kids, and we had things planted into us that are so valuable and so good. And they're things that we know. We know them at a deep level and we've experienced them, right? So, what happens? What happens to those things as we continue to grow? I think they get covered up and they get drowned out by the noise, by the cognitive clamor, by the failures that we experience, by the rejections that we experience, by the years that go by. And we get ourselves stuck in the system of our society, right? And we forget some of the truth and beauty that we once knew with clarity. There are so many voices telling us that we're not good enough, right? We're not smart enough. We're not thin enough. We're not pretty enough. We're not tall enough. We're not short enough. We're not strong enough. We're not fast enough. The list could go on for a very long time because there are voices all around us telling us those things. And so all those voices, they kind of start to drown out the truth and beauty that we once knew about ourselves and about who we were created to be. There's a constant assault on who we are created to be. And we forget the truth that what we've been working so hard to get, we've already got. And that's a self-worth loving. We do. That does exist in each one of us. It already exists. So finding that self and listening to that self, so important. So important. These are things that we already know. And they're not gone. They're not gone. The things we've learned about joy and fear and love and persistence and goal setting and self-worth, those things aren't gone. We know them. So how do we listen to them, right? Clearing out that noise and rediscovering that, such good work. Such good work. And it's part of what we're doing together this summer and what we're going to do moving forward in the future of Circle A. So, what are the ways of knowing? The ways of knowing. If we're going to begin to silence some of that stuff that started to bury the truth of what we know and who we are, how do we begin to unearth that? How do we begin to listen to that voice again? Well, I'm not an expert, but I do read the experts, and I can tell you what the experts say. That's a quote from my dad, if you didn't catch it. He said that a lot. The experts tell us that there are three ways of knowing things. Three ways of knowing things: the head, the heart, and the gut. Head, heart, and gut. You guys have probably heard that before because it is indeed what the experts tell us, right? Neuroscience actually tells us that we have three brains. Some scientists go that far to say we actually have three brains wired into our bodies, right? And the one that we think about the most often and pay the most attention to is our head brain, right? The cephalic brain. But we also have a heart brain, a cardiac brain, and we have a gut brain, an enteric brain. And each of these brains has their own neurons and motor neurons and ganglia and neurotransmitters in these different parts of our physical bodies. This isn't just metaphorical, it's actually physical as well, right? And each of these different parts of us are able to take in information and process it and store it and communicate with the other parts of our bodies. They're all actually brains. So we're going to think about these three brains real quick. The head, of course, is our cognition brain, right? This is the place of logic and reason. It's the place where rational thinking happens and where we make decisions. It's where we make sense of things, and especially the practical data that we receive, right? And the brain is one of the most complex organs in the body. The head brain, most complex organ in the body. It's composed of over 100 billion neurons that communicate along trillions of connections. So it's an amazing part of our bodies, right? But it's actually only one of three, because the second brain is our heart brain. And it refers to our feelings, of course, right? This is how we experience things in terms of our emotions. And it's where we process things on an experiential level, right? Besides the data, the other parts of our experiences, they're more to do with our heart and our feelings and our emotions. And as we think about our experiences, we remember how they made us feel, right? But a study has revealed that humans actually have around 40,000 cardiac neurons working together to communicate across the heart's nervous system, all along up to the brain. So there's actually a physical brain that resides in our heart, as well as what we're talking about metaphorically with our experiences, our feelings, our emotions, right? And then there's our gut. Our gut refers to our instinct and our intuition, okay? And it's our immediate and direct response to our world and the things that happen to us. It's kind of before it gets to the head or the heart, it goes through the gut. And we have an immediate instinctual reaction and response to what goes on. And then it refers to our actual gut, right? Our actual stomach and intestines may be sending us information about a situation to help us better understanding our surroundings, or to help us sense a subtle feeling of fear, or whatever the case may be, right? We are human creatures gifted with these three different ways of knowing: head, heart, gut. Okay. So, an important part of the work of listening to yourself is to learn, first of all, which way is most normal for you. Which way do you kind of hear yourself the best? Because some of us are really, really tuned in to our gut and our instinct, right? Some of us are really tuned into our brains, to the data we process, to the information that we gather. And some of us are really tuned into our feelings, right? But the way of listening is about learning to process data from all three ways of knowing. Because sometimes if we get stuck on just one, we don't get the full picture. We don't make the best choice. Or we forget some things that we once knew because we're we're fixating on one specific way of knowing. So part of the work then is to begin to tap into the other ways of knowing. As we crowd out that cognitive clamor, as we slow down to listen to ourselves, and we begin to get awareness of what am I thinking? What am I feeling? And what is my instinct in this situation or in this conversation? Head, heart, and gut, right? All three are essential so that we can get a fully informed picture of what our self is actually saying, right? Now, I don't have a whole lot of teaching today on what that path of integration looks like. That would have to be another conversation that we don't have time for today. But it's good work. It's important work as we are learning to listen. If we can learn to listen to ourselves in those three ways, then we can get better at listening to others in those three ways too. And that's super important, right? So I encourage you on that path of integrative listening to the head, the heart, and the gut. And whether that's through coaching or counseling or through reading or study or just through increased awareness of the reality that we do have all of those information processes going on at the same time in our bodies, it can help us do a much better job at listening to ourselves and remembering the truth of the things that we once knew. So here's a few steps to get us started on the ways of knowing, right? First, quiet the noise. If we're going to listen, that's always step number one, right? Second would be to increase your awareness of the three ways of knowing. Third would be to notice and make notes of your thoughts, feelings, and intuitions. And then fourth would be study and learn more about integrative listening. Now, I could give you a lot of examples of listening to only one of our ways of knowing and of how that can lead us astray. I'll use a personal example, and it's a silly example, and I don't particularly love using this example because I feel like as a Circle A kid, I should probably not have struggled with this, but I do struggle with this. And I'll just be honest, I have a little bit of trouble flying on airplanes. I don't know why it developed, really. It developed in my 20s, so it wasn't even a childhood thing. But over the last 20 years of my life, I've struggled flying with a fear of flying. And it's pretty weird because my head brain, my logic brain, can think of no reason why I should have a fear of flying. There's no logical reason why this fear exists. But there's something in my gut that's telling me I should be very uneasy when this plane rattles around in the air, right? And if I only listen to my gut, I probably wouldn't want to get on an airplane. But I can do the integrative work of listening. I'm not quite sure if my heart tells me I should or shouldn't get on an airplane. I'd have to do some thinking about that. But I'm quite sure my head and my gut are at odds about getting on an airplane. Okay. But if I can do the integrative listening, maybe my heart tells me I should get on an airplane so that I can go to do whatever the wonderful thing it is that I would be getting on the airplane to do. And that convinces me to do it. I don't know. But I think you can catch what I'm saying about the different ways of knowing and how we listen to ourselves and help ourselves move forward into the best path for us by listening to all three and kind of working through all three. So I'm going to leave that at that today. Maybe we can talk more about it together one of these days soon, because I'd love to hear some of your stories and some of your perspectives on the three ways of knowing. But we're going to go to the next portion of our conversation, which is about the ways of healing. So the reason we listen to ourselves is 1, the ways of knowing, 2, the ways of healing, 3, the ways of growing. So we're going to talk about healing, right? By listening to ourselves, we can begin to heal the damage done to our hearts by internal and external forces. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm going to narrow it down real fast and real directly to exactly what I mean by that today. I think most of our internal brokenness, whether internal or external forces, most of our internal brokenness can be boiled down to one word, and that's shame. Shame, right? This feeling that there is something inherently wrong with who we are. The feelings that we're not enough. The feelings that we have failed and we are failures. That shame thing can bury every good thing that's been planted into us. As we were talking at the beginning about all the things that we've learned at Circle A over the years, you get a few layers of shame on top of that stuff, and you can't find it at all because shame is significant brokenness. And it happens to all of us. It's part of the human experience. It's not something we can completely protect ourselves from, but it is something we can heal from. It is something we can heal from. Shame can be caused by so many damaging experiences, right? All different kinds. Sin, it can be caused by abuse, it can be caused by trauma, it can be caused by failure, by specific experiences of losing a job or going through a breakup or flunking a class. So many different things can lead us to an experience of shame. And really, most of our deep brokenness as humans centers around shame. So the experts tell us that the healing of our shame begins with the exposure of it, right? It begins when those feelings and experiences are expressed, are brought to light, then shame kind of loses its power. Because while they're not expressed, do you know where they're sitting? Well, they're sitting in our brains, but specifically, they're sitting in our unconscious mind or our subconscious mind, where that little man in the basement is running around pulling all the evidence about whatever these experiences are, pulling all the evidence to say, yep, you are a failure. Yep, you're not enough. And here's all the extra evidence as to why. And that little man in the basement, if he's not working for us, he's working against us. And he's building layers of shame. And we don't want to live like that. That's not the dynamic life that we were taught, that we were invited to, and that we're created to live in, right? So, as when we speak our shame and when it's heard with grace, it comes to light and we begin to mend, right? When we accept God's grace into our shame, true healing begins. When we accept the truth that what we've been working so hard to get, we've already got, and that's a self worth loving, because our Creator created us to be worth loving. And when we accept that truth, our shame is healed, or it's certainly on the path to healing, right? So again, I don't have time to unpack this one today, but I am going to point you to a couple books. And the first one is a book called Shame No More by Dr. Richard Shaw. It's actually a book that I had the great honor to be a part of writing and publishing. And his work around shame is absolutely fantastic. I can't recommend this book more highly for this process of healing and listening to ourselves in the healing process. And then, of course, all of Brene Brown's work is absolutely fantastic around shame. I love all of her stuff. If you haven't read any of her work, I would start with the book called The Gifts of Imperfection. So you could check that out as well. But to really complete the healing work, okay, we have to do more than just speak our shame and receive grace. If we're really going to become the people that we are created to be, we're going to follow another thing that my dad always taught us, and that's the affirmation of the people we are. The truth about who we actually are, right? Not the shame version of ourselves, but the true version of ourselves. And so Dad always taught us to affirm the type of person that we want to be. And as we remove these false messages about our failure and about that we're not enough and about our shame, then we replace them with the true and beautiful messages about who we actually are and who we want to become, right? So I recommend a list of affirmations, just like Dad teaches us about in the seminar. And I recommend we read it every morning and every night. I personally have about 14 affirmations about myself that I read every day. And I will tell you that the more I read and affirm them about myself, the more I see them becoming true in my life, right? I see like that thing that I've been reading about balancing rest and work. Man, I'm seeing it be true in my life. And that is so affirming, right? That's exactly the point. So you're listening to Dynamic Living by Skip Ross. You've already got some of the best teaching there is out there on this subject. I'm going to recommend another new resource it's a book called Soundtracks by Jon Acuff. And it's a really fun, modern version of so many of the things about affirmations that we've been taught. So I really strongly recommend that book. Um, the truth is that we're always listening to ourselves. We are. That little man in the basement's always telling us something. So the question is, what are we saying? What are we saying? What are we telling ourselves? Are we telling ourselves that we're failures who don't deserve love and belonging? Or are we telling ourselves that we are beautiful, wonderful creations of God who are becoming what He created us to be? Because what we're telling ourselves matters more than we can even put words around, right? So I hope we'll choose to heal by telling ourselves the truth of who we are. Okay, last one for today. We're going to talk about the ways of growing. Growing. I think you guys are probably familiar at this point with the idea of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity, right? Basically, brain scientists have discovered that we can actually rewire our brains. We can actually change the form and the function of our brains by the input that we give ourselves. It's truly incredible, and I feel like we're still probably only scratching the surface of this truth. But we already know this because Dad's been teaching us this for lots of years, right? This was no surprise when all of this research came out. No surprise to him because he's taught it to us for years. He's taught us the principle of command, which is basically whatever you say will happen. So be careful what you say, right? Now, we can learn that and apply it to being careful that we don't say negative things that we don't want to have happen to us, right? But in the context of our growth, which is what we're talking about now, think about what can happen as we begin to tell ourselves the right messages, right? We can actually uproot toxic thoughts from our head and replace them with healthy, whole, productive thoughts. It's really pretty incredible. And I'll tell you, another great resource for me has been a book called Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess by Dr. Caroline Leaf. And there are lots of wonderful resources out there about this. So I invite you to be on that journey of growing your brain, of rewiring your brain to do the thinking work that you want it to do. Put your brain to work for you. It's incredible what can happen. Here's a quote from Dr. Shaw's book, Shame No More, about this. So listen to this for a second. He writes, "This dynamic development of our brains gives us incredible hope. We can change. We can physically rewrite neural pathways and heal broken patterns. We were created with the ability to choose new endgames for the pain and brokenness we experience. We can teach ourselves to instantly respond to shame triggers with the attributes of grace instead of the attributes of shame. Instead of control, we can learn empowerment. Instead of perfectionism, we can learn excellence. Instead of blame, we can learn responsibility." And the list goes on. The best part is we can do better than learn these things. We can develop neural pathways so that our brain responds intuitively with these healthy behaviors. Isn't that amazing? We can not only rewire our brains, but we can teach them to react differently to stimuli that we're given. And we can change the way that we respond to difficult situations in life. It's pretty incredible. And I think that sounds like a huge amount of growth and change to me, right? But in order to do that work of rewiring our brains, we have to listen to ourselves and we have to do the work of uprooting those toxic thoughts and planting the healthy thoughts that we want to be true about us and the way that we respond to the world. So I can just tell you a personal story about me over the last few years. I had begun to struggle with some anxiety, and it was manifesting itself in several different ways in my life, mostly physically. Um, so it was a really interesting time for me, especially being Skip Ross's daughter. And I tried different ways of battling it, all sorts of different health ways, all sorts of different things, really, to try and battle this anxiety situation. But the thing that absolutely turned the corner on it for me was this neuroplasticity awareness and this, like, exactly what Dad's always taught, a daily, deliberate programming of the unconscious mind with confidence building, fear defeating thoughts. And it really was day after day after day of working through where this anxiety was coming from and of saying the truth about how I wanted to respond. Most of my anxiety was strangely about physical illness and physical danger. Um, so saying the truth about what was really true about me, about that I am healthy, that I am pursuing health, that I love adventure, all of these sorts of positive affirmations about what is actually true. And my anxiety has shifted so far, you guys. So, it's one thing to hear this stuff your whole life, but to put it into practice and actually see it have a absolutely life transforming effect was pretty powerful. So, I invite you, if you are struggling with anxiety, if you're struggling with relational issues, really any sort of struggle where there's a toxic thought in your mind, if you can replace it with what is really true or what you want to be true about that situation and work on it every day, you will see a change. You will rewire your brain. There's a lot of great resources out there to help you do that, though. So I do recommend the resources. All right. As we wrap up our time today, we're going to think of another way of listening to ourselves in order to grow. And that's with our goals. Our goals, right? We're back to that 3x5 card, of course, because Dad told us a million times, and it's so true, to write our goals and to read them every morning and every night and every morning and every night. This keeps our head and our heart and our gut kind of on the same growth mindset. And we will see these things come to fruition in our lives because we will see opportunities to move towards them as we're focusing our minds on them, right? And I still do it. I still do it to this day. I have my 10 goals every year and I read them every day. And the power we hold to influence the course of our lives by the way that we listen to ourselves and by what we tell ourselves is astronomical. It's not even describable, right? And so I invite you to remember that truth and to take some action into seizing your destiny, right? To managing the course of your life in the direction that you want it to go, because you do hold the power to do that. And it all is about what you're telling yourself on a day-to-day basis, right? Listening to ourselves is so important. We listen into the ways of knowing, our head and our heart and our gut. And then we listen into the ways of healing, of speaking our shame and receiving grace and affirming the truth about ourselves. And then we listen into the ways of growing, of rewiring our brains to choose healthier growth patterns and move towards the list of things that we want to be true in our lives, want to accomplish, and want to become. So we're always listening to ourselves. What are we saying? What are we saying? Now, to close up today, I'm going to read a section of Daily Disciplines. This is one of Skip's books that he wrote. I helped him write several years ago. And my dad wrote this, and I think it sums up pretty well what we're talking about when we're saying we're always listening to ourselves, but what are we saying? So let's listen to Dad's words. He writes, I've learned a truth about life that has helped me in times of great discouragement or loneliness or failure. There's deep importance in choosing to be my own best friend. This is not because others in my life can't encourage me or have deep, intimate, life-giving relationships with me. Rather, it is because if I am not deliberately working to act as my own best friend, I can easily turn into my own worst enemy. There is constant interior monologue about ourselves that we listen to. There is one voice that is consistently building us up and encouraging us, and another voice that is consistently belittling us and discouraging us. Those two voices come from the same person, and that person is our own self. And if we're not careful to choose which version of the interior monologue is playing, we can easily fall into the negative version. The fact is that in any situation, in any challenge, in any triumph, there will be both good and bad. There will be things to applaud and admire and celebrate, and there will be things to mock and criticize and scorn. So in those moments where we need the positive voice to focus on the good pieces of whatever situation we find ourselves in, are we our own best friend or our own worst enemy? Which voice will we choose to listen to? I want to be my own best friend. A best friend will encourage me in times of difficulties. A best friend will help me feel better about myself. There are people in my life that make me feel better about myself every time I am with them. When I leave, I feel more encouraged and empowered about my life and myself and my future. I want to be one of those people, not only for the friends and associates around me, but for myself too. So let's work this week on being our own best friend, and I'll see you next time.